"You're not going to believe who I saw at the market," Lila said, her eyes gleaming with excitement as she stepped into the dimly lit room. Her brother William barely looked up from his book, his mind preoccupied with the end of his school term exams. "Who?" he asked, his voice flat with disinterest. "Mr. Jenkins," she exclaimed, a hint of scandal in her tone. "The butcher's son, you know, the one who everyone says went off to join the army without telling anyone." William's gaze snapped to hers, his heart skipping a beat. "Really? What did he say?" "Well," she began, drawing out the word for dramatic effect, "he said he's been drafted. Can you imagine? Just like that, off to fight in the war." The room grew silent as the gravity of her words settled in the air. The Great War had been going on for 2 years now, and its shadow had touched everyone in their small town. William had heard whispers of boys his age leaving for the front, but it had always felt like something that happened to other people. Now the reality was knocking at their door, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He closed his book with a thud, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Their mother looked up from her sewing, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and resignation. She knew what was coming next. "How can they just take him away like that?" William said, his voice rising. "He's only 17. Lila shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "It's the law now. Everyone has to do their part." Their mother set down her needle and thread, her hands trembling slightly. "It's for the greater good, son," she said, her voice wavering. "We all have to make sacrifices." But William couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had taken root in his stomach. He had always been the quiet one, the thinker, not the fighter. The thought of leaving behind the safety of their town and the comfort of his family was unbearable. The following week, the letter arrived, as cold and impersonal as the war itself. It was from the British government, stating that William had been selected to serve in the army. His heart sank as he read the words that would change his life forever. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been drafted." Her face paled, but she managed a small, sad smile. "We knew this day might come. You'll make us proud, William. Just remember to keep your head down and come home to us." He nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. As he packed his meager belongings into a duffel bag, he couldn't help but think of Mr. Jenkins' empty butcher shop, a stark reminder of the lives that had already been irrevocably altered by the war. The day of his departure was gray and misty, the kind of day that seemed to hold the world in a suffocating embrace. His father's firm handshake and Lila's tearful goodbye were the last bits of warmth he felt before he stepped onto the train that would take him to basic training. As the countryside rolled by, William couldn't help but wonder if he would ever see it again. The thought of fighting in the trenches, surrounded by the deafening roar of artillery and the stench of death, was overwhelming. But he knew he had no choice. It was his turn to make a sacrifice for king and country. The train rumbled on, pulling him further and further from home, and with every mile that passed, William felt the weight of his new reality pressing down on him like the heaviest of yokes. This was the beginning of his journey into the heart of darkness, a journey from which he might never return. When he finally disembarked in France, the stark contrast between the idyllic landscapes of his imagination and the grim reality of war slapped him in the face like a cold, wet towel. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and decay, and the once beautiful countryside was now a scarred and barren wasteland. He saw men, not much older than him, with hollowed eyes and grimy faces, returning from the front lines, their uniforms in tatters and their spirits seemingly broken. The sight was sobering, a stark reminder of the hellish existence that awaited him. The trek to the front was a blur of muddy trenches, endless marching, and the constant, gnawing fear that seemed to cling to everything like a thick fog. He heard the distant thunder of artillery, a constant drumbeat that never ceased, and the occasional screams of the wounded that pierced the night air like a mournful symphony. His fellow soldiers, hardened by months of fighting, spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of bravery and loss that made William's blood run cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he arrived at his post, a soggy patch of earth that was to be his home for the foreseeable future. The trenches were a labyrinth of despair, filled with the stench of unwashed bodies and the ever-present odor of fear. The men around him were a motley crew, their faces a tableau of hardened resolve and weary resignation. They offered him a place to sit, a cigarette, and a cup of lukewarm tea that tasted faintly of metal. "Welcome to the party, lad," one of them said, a gruff smile etched into the dirt on his face. "You'll get used to it." But William wasn't sure he wanted to get used to it. As he looked out over the desolate no-man's land, the thought of charging into the jaws of death made his stomach churn. Yet, as he listened to the quiet camaraderie of the soldiers around him, he knew that he was not alone in his fear. They were all bound by the same invisible threads of duty and fate, and together they would face whatever the war had in store for them. The moment he had been dreading came sooner than he had anticipated. An officer barked orders and the men around him stood up, their faces a mask of determination. William swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest like a drum, as he followed suit. They climbed out of the trench, one by one, and into the open field, where the only sound was the deafening crescendo of war. The earth trembled beneath their boots as they moved forward, a line of ants marching to the beat of a drummer they could not see. The whistle of bullets and the screams of the dying filled the air, and William's mind went numb. He had read about war in his books, had seen it glorified in the papers, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The world around him was a chaotic symphony of horror, and he was just one small, insignificant note in its grim melody. And yet, as he took his place on the battlefield, something within him stirred. It wasn't bravery, nor was it patriotism. It was a simple, primal instinct to survive, to protect those around him, and to make it back home to his mother and sister. He raised his rifle, took a deep breath, and stepped into the fray, ready to face whatever the war had in store for him. The war had come for William, and now William was going to war. The Germans began firing, and the world around him turned into a nightmare of explosions and flying earth. His mind snapped into focus, and his training took over. He saw the enemy, a mere shadow in the chaos, and without hesitation he fired back. The impact of the bullet was muffled by the cacophony of battle, but he felt the recoil in his bones. A moment later the shadow fell still, and a human form lay lifeless on the ground. The sight of his first kill shook him to his core, but there was no time for reflection. The British charge was on, and William was swept along with it, his fear momentarily overshadowed by the fierce adrenaline that surged through his veins. They sprinted through the no-man's land, dodging bullets and leaping over the barbed wire that had claimed so many before them. The ground beneath their feet was a quagmire of mud and blood, but they pushed on, driven by the roar of their comrades and the primal need to survive. As they approached the German trench, the firing grew more intense, but then something unexpected happened. The Germans began to throw down their weapons, their hands in the air, their faces etched with terror and desperation. The British line faltered, unsure of what to make of this sudden surrender. And then, with a rush of disbelief, they were over the edge, into the enemy's lair. The air was thick with the scent of fear and defeat. The Germans, exhausted and demoralized, offered no resistance. They crouched in the bottom of their trench, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they had been bested. William and his comrades advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready, but there was no fight left in the enemy. The British soldiers looked around in amazement, their hearts pounding from the exertion and the sudden absence of danger. As the dust settled and the ringing in William's ears began to fade, he realized the gravity of what had just occurred. They had taken a German trench, something that had seemed almost impossible only moments before. The weight of his rifle grew heavier in his arms, and he felt a sudden kinship with the terrified young men before him. They were not so different, after all. Just pawns in a game played by old men in faraway places, sacrificing their youth and their futures for a cause that neither truly understood. The battle was over, for now. But the war raged on, a never-ending beast that consumed everything in its path. And as William looked into the eyes of the vanquished, he knew that the real fight was just beginning. For him, for his newfound comrades, and for the millions of souls who had been torn apart by the jaws of conflict. The war had changed him irrevocably, and he could only hope that somehow, amidst the carnage and the loss, he would find a way to hold on to the shreds of humanity that still clung to his heart. The young Germans stared back at him, their eyes wide with fear. They couldn't have been much older than him, their faces still sprinkled with the innocence of youth. One of them, a boy with blonde hair and trembling hands, spoke in a shaky voice, "Please, please don't shoot." William's grasp on his rifle loosened as he recognized the desperation in the boy's eyes. He knew enough German to understand the plea for mercy. With a nod to his fellow soldiers, he stepped closer and spoke in a gentle tone, "We don't shoot. Are you giving up?" The blond boy nodded, his relief palpable. His comrades followed suit, their expressions a mix of hope and disbelief. They were just children, like him, thrown into a world of horror and pain that they had never asked for. William felt a pang of pity for them, and in that moment the enemy lines blurred. What's happening now?" another one asked, his voice quivering. William didn't have the heart to tell them what awaited them as prisoners of war. Instead, he offered a reassuring smile and said, "We'll get you to safety." He gestured for them to come out of the trench, and one by one they did, their heads bowed in defeat. As they walked back towards the British lines, the silence between them was deafening. William's thoughts were a jumble of confusion and anger. How could this be right? How could they be fighting each other, when they were all just pawns in a game played by those who had never felt the sting of a bullet or the cold embrace of fear? But as they approached the makeshift camp, the reality of war slapped him back into the present. The cries of the wounded, the shouts of commanding officers, and the grim determination etched into the faces of his comrades brought him back to the present. This was his life now, and he had to find a way to live it, to survive it. Their first encounter with the enemy had been a victory, but William knew it was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more bloodshed, more moments when he would have to look into the eyes of scared young men and make a choice. And as he handed over his prisoners to the waiting sergeant, he made a silent vow to himself to remember their fear, to hold on to his humanity, and to do whatever it took to make it home. For now, though, he had a job to do. He helped the Germans strip off their uniforms and handed them blankets to cover their shivering forms. They were no longer enemies, just boys who had made a mistake, and he hoped that somewhere on the other side of the lines, someone was treating his own countrymen with the same compassion. The night grew colder, and the sounds of war grew distant, replaced by the whispers of the wind and the occasional crackle of a campfire. William sat with his back against the earthen wall of the trench, his thoughts a tumultuous sea of doubt and determination. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horrors, and perhaps even new moments of unexpected camaraderie, but for now he was alive, and that was enough. He took a deep breath, the taste of gunpowder still lingering on his tongue, and closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of his racing heart lull him into a fitful sleep. Dreams of home danced at the edge of his consciousness, a tantalizing mirage that seemed so close and yet so far away. And as he drifted off, he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever see the faces of his mother and sister again, or if he would become just another name etched into a stone, a silent sentinel to the futility of war. Days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. William wrote letters home, trying to paint a picture of heroism and valor, but the words on the page felt hollow. The truth was, he was just trying to survive, to make it through each day without losing another piece of himself to the relentless grind of battle. The trenches became his world, a universe of mud and blood and fear that stretched on forever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield, a strange calm settled over the trenches. The firing had ceased, and for a brief moment, the only sounds were the whimpers of the dying and the cries of the night birds. Then from the German lines came a sound that was both eerie and beautiful, the strains of a violin, playing a mournful tune that seemed to resonate with the very soul of the earth itself. The British soldiers looked at each other in amazement, their rifles lowered. The music was a bridge across the chasm that separated them, a reminder that, despite the uniforms and the flags, they were all just men who loved and lost, who hoped and feared. William felt his eyes fill with tears as he listened, his heart aching for the humanity that had been buried beneath the layers of mud and the weight of his own fear. The tune grew softer, and then, as if on cue, a voice began to sing. It was a song he knew, a folk song from his own village, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming longing for the simplicity of his old life. He picked up his rifle, not to shoot, but to hold it close, like a talisman that could somehow protect him from the madness that surrounded him. As the music faded into the night, he made a decision. He would not let the war define him. He would fight, yes, but he would also live. He would find moments of beauty amidst the horror, and he would cling to them like a lifeline, a reminder that there was still goodness in the world. And when the time came, he would go home, not as a hero, but as a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to remember the best. The next morning, the fighting resumed with a ferocity that took William by surprise. But as he took his place in the line, his eyes searched the German trenches for the face of the musician, the boy who had played that haunting melody. And though he never saw him again, he knew that somewhere out there, amidst the chaos and the destruction, there was a spark of humanity that refused to be extinguished. And so William carried on, fighting for his life, fighting for his sanity, and fighting for the hope that one day the world would learn from the mistakes of its past, and that the trenches of war would become nothing more than a distant memory. A cautionary tale told to children who could not imagine the horrors that had once been a part of their ancestors' daily lives. And as the war raged on, he clung to that hope with every ounce of strength he had, because it was all he had left.